Ratchet and Clank Rift Apart has bombed on Steam. It is Sony PlayStation's third worst selling game on the platform ever. It has something like 5,000 players or something right now. It's been a complete disaster, and this goes into what I've been saying about like PlayStation on PC, in that like without like the console propping it up, without like legions of fanboys, without like naive first time gamers buying every new Sony property that comes out, without like real gaming journalist propaganda hyping it up as like the next big thing, without people trying to tell you that Ratchet and Clank is way more successful than Star Fox Pro. Like without that, Ratchet and Clank has no audience. Like without that, like every PlayStation exclusive has no audience because at their core, every PlayStation exclusive has a better alternative on other platforms. Uncharted, you have Tomb Raider, you have like, other third person shooters like Gears of War and Resident Evil 4. You have like better games that exist, right? And like it doesn't matter what matter whether you play them or not. Like the what matters is like whether like the general audience is going to like just get excited at these new upcoming games. And more as time goes on, and like the industry gets more and more like congested with like all of these great games that like nobody has time to play. More and more of these mediocre games that are like sold to the public as masterpieces, stuff like The Last of Us, stuff like Uncharted, stuff like Jack and Daxter, stuff like Ratchet and Clank, stuff like Spider-Man PS4, stuff like Days Gone, stuff like God of War Ragnarok, stuff like all of this junk, right? Like all this stuff that just comes out is more and more kind of floundering in the marketplace. And it's not just because people are getting bored of the IPs or the characters or PlayStation or gaming or AAA gaming. Like it's because the games at their core are not that good, right? Like if you've played a Ratchet and Clank game, you've played them all. Right? If you played a God of War game, you've played them all. Like the franchises don't innovate, change, or evolve, and eventually people get tired of them far sooner, I would argue, than most people realize. Like God of War 2 is a really interesting example of that, where there was a clear drop off in interest going from God of War 1 to 2, not the reboot trilogy, the original. And from there it just got worse and worse. Like God of War 3 won a bunch of Game of the Year awards, but you can go back and look and see that people had mixed the feelings on the game even then. And that led into like, the endless sequels that did progressively worse, and then the reboot, which tried to completely reinvent itself and which also bombed in the end. So what this means is that like we are in an era where PlayStation is losing its market relevancy. Like I primarily talk about the hardware, the third-party exclusives, because that's really what matters to me, is talking about like how Nintendo hardware is superior and how talking about how Nintendo games are superior, right? But when it comes to the first-party exclusives, the games that like people tell you are like the best ever, right? They'll try making like they'll try saying that like Naughty Dog is one of the best gaming studios of all time and stuff like that. Like there are people who will try to tell you that, but like it's not true, right? Like there's really nothing more that needs to be said about that. Is that like the entire narrative that's been like fabricated since the 90s, that like PlayStation has games that Nintendo don't. Like, ooh, look at these mature games for mature gamers. Like kiddie Nintendo will never have any of this. And then of course we've seen the company like just kind of grow and evolve. Like we saw this with Pikmin, which kind of reinvents the natural world with like predators and prey and like having this strange like bleak, dark, desolate like natural world, right? Like in a lot of ways, Pikmin is more mature than like a lot of the games that PlayStation has put out ever. Actually, all of them, I would say. Like, because nothing really recreates that feeling of Pikmin, right? Right. All PlayStation did when convincing you that like they were mature games for mature gamers was like uh, take a take a few realistic character models, give it full voice acting, and maybe give it some FMV cutscenes, right? That's how they tricked you into thinking the games were more mature than they really are. And eventually, like the illusion like faded. Eventually, people started seeing through it. Eventually, people started realizing that like, wow, The Last of Us really isn't that good of an IP. Wow, these games really don't run that well on PC. Wow, these games have lots of issues. Wow, this game is pure propaganda. Wow, this is just not that fun. Why am I even bothering? And that feeling is translating very much into like the Steam sales, right? PlayStation started putting their games on Steam out of this expectation that it would boost their numbers, keep their first party titles relevant, and get people fired up for the sequels, right? God of War 2018 came out just before God of War Ragnarok. The idea was to like pressure PC gamers into going out and getting God of War Ragnarok after playing God of War 2018, but that simply didn't happen, right? The Last of Us came out. Uncharted came out. Days Gone came out. Like, Death Stranding came out. Like, Horizon Zero Dawn came out. Like, there are so many examples of games that came out on PC that didn't do all that well, and the sequels just did even worse, right? Because now people like are seeing that there is no reason to buy a PlayStation, right? Like these games are coming to PC, so you may as well just get a PC and ignore the inferior PlayStation platform. Like that is the situation we're in right now. Is that like PlayStation has essentially destroyed any reason it ever had to exist, and weirdly enough, it feels more like Xbox is in a better place. It feels more like Nintendo's in a better place. Like it feels like we're in this weird position where nobody wants to admit that PlayStation is just a dying platform. Nobody wants to admit that this company is failing to be successful.